Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. I followed the discussion of the previous session with great interest. Unfortunately, I couldn't participate, but I think I will contribute with this paper to a lot of the things that have been already said. So let's get this done. Then it shouldn't be longer than 25 minutes. When conceptualizing the idea for today's paper, I immediately remembered Andrea Batorov's thoughtful review of the anthology Thomas Strauss, Beyond the Great Divide, essays on European avant-garde, avant-gardes from East to West, published recently on Art Margins Online. The intellectual universe of Strauss's art theory and criticism was characterized by richness, diversity, and plurality of cultural facets. He wandered different geopolitical territories and always was a bi, if not multilingual figure of the East Central European art scenes. Batorova stresses how important it is that Strauss's work, besides Slovak and German, will finally be available in English. At a conference devoted to transfers across regions and actions/individuals of a so-called transregional spirit, one clearly has to hold on for a while when he/she reads lines like Batorov's, I quote, "And there are yet more crucial texts written by the critic after he moved back to Bratislava that are awaiting their translation in future," end of quote. Language is a fundamental key to accessing information, to distributing it, and keep the exchange circles running. The speakers and attendees of this conference are interested in. Language, here I mean the Resonances Symposium, a common denominator and fairly often treated as a pure tool to allow us to work with our source material and collaborators, is indeed often overlooked as a concept or method. The little attention language got in area studies, at least in the past few years, is, for instance, documented in a single essay in the Routledge Handbook of Transregional Studies published 3 years ago. The author of this contribution, philologist Jürgen Erfurt, convincingly shows how language is a constituent of geography and how it is attached to human actions. According to Erfurt, linguistic action is embodiment. It can be demarcation, symbolic power, and market. Language clearly leaves us a track to follow people and media that unfold through tongue. I mean language here, of course. We can understand the social relations, the creation of space and appropriation when we understand languages. Motivated by these thoughts, I decided to stimulate methodological discussion on the issue of language and its transmission in the research on art production in state socialisms. While decolonizing East and Central European art has gained a lot of attention recently, I consider language through the multinational and multilingual realities and histories of the region an even more attempting analytical approach. My take on transregional art history will follow the path of languages. First, methodologically, then through the selected case studies. 3 selected case studies. The languages I'm tracing in this paper are constantly on the move, are embodied, infiltrated, appropriated, and recirculated in different ways. This is the reason why the contours of a new cultural geography I draw are reliant on translation. Translation, a process that keeps languages in circulation and exchange. Today, I will depart from an expanded concept of translation, the erweiterte Übersetzungsbegriff, which to my ears sounds even more convincing in German. This notion of translation will be taken as a point to discuss since when, how, and why translation among many relatively recent cultural turns can be accepted as a concept in the humanities. My introduction to the case studies will further deal with Emily Apter's translation zone and Katrin Evuthov's cultural gradient as a matrix to investigate social, cultural, and intellectual transfers / transmissions attached to language. Case study number 1 will briefly look into how mediators regularly wandering between different linguistic cultures, here Hungarian and Polish, can be regarded as translators, both in practice and metaphorically. The second example will focus on translated culture in print, following the structural editorial overview of the Romanian literary and art magazine, Secolul 20, in English, the 20th century. I apologize for all of my foreign pronunciation, which is not German, not English, and not Hungarian. Under editor-in-chief, Dan Haulika. And my final focal point will bring me to the National Gallery in Prague, a place we have already been, and the exciting language path of the Performance Art Circle. Instead of finished conclusions, since this is an ongoing research project, through these examples, I would like to open a forum for research potentials in transregional studies. In the past years, transdisciplinarity and border crossings, in our art historic and visual studies became common sense, but in the setting of today's symposium, it may be productive to reflect on these phenomena. The program of the International Research Center for Cultural Studies at the University of Art and Design in Linz, in Vienna, but the research center is located in Vienna, has, for instance, in 2016 established a research focus on cultures of translation. The foundation of this program is the previously mentioned expanded concept of translation that in its expansion incorporates, to name at least a few, social, media, and technology history likewise. The discussion spans over attempts to transfer architectural constructions, landscapes, images, or musical compositions into texts, signs, diagrams, and codes, and the other way around. Similarly, the integration of text, image, and music in diverse media could enliven debates on the Gesamtkunstwerk. Information, signs, behavioral and emotional patterns transmitted through various cultural and knowledge systems are at the core of the erweiterte Übersetzungsbegriff. As announced on the website of the Research Center, their aim is to explore and further expand the contours of a translational turn. As I have mentioned shortly, and here I will quote scholar of literary and cultural studies, Doris Bachmann-Medic, the translational turn is, I quote, part of a wider cross-disciplinary chain of cultural turns like the interpretive turn, performative turn, iconic turn, post-colonial turn, spatial turn, and so forth, end of quote. It was at the end of the 1990s when translation started to gain acceptance as a methodologically reflected analytical category across disciplines. Society, culture, and our field of interest, the arts, have countless contact points, not necessarily without conflict or rupture, that can be grasped if their contact becomes the subject of translation. In the case of translation, in case translation goes beyond a pure metaphor, it can support researchers of cultural history to study, I quote, cultural differences, power imbalances, and scopes for action when overlappings, passages, transmissions, and transformations are at work, end of quote. In one of the three examples I will explore in this paper, these processes would be the cultural political perception of the shared trauma of 1956 revolutions in both Hungary and Poland, and how the tensions the memory of this event caused in their artistic transmission. In another case, this would be the carefully curated international content of the journal 20th Century. What kind of contemporary, modern, or classic works of art and literature were translated into Romanian? Why were in a Romanian magazine original Romanian contributions translated into French and English? What is the status of French culture? What was the ambition of the magazine's editor-in-chief? And what were the local and international settings and cultural politics which allowed for translations to be published? Following the course of language and its filters along its traveling curve, we can benefit from reinterpreting situations of global encounter, difference, and conflict. Translation along the lines of the translational turn goes beyond texts. It expands into social action where analysis from multiple angles is a requirement. Bachmann-Medic ascribes the origin of interest in translation studies primarily to post-colonial discourse. Without intending a deep dive into post-colonial theory, I would like to mention here two aspects that can support our transregional ambition in East and Central European art history. One, as we often revisit histories through close readings of wandering agents and artifacts, with the support of translation, we may be able to illuminate, I quote, micro processes of historical transformation, end of quote. And two, it is most interesting in the current approaches to critical area studies, how they experiment with creative reinterpretations of concepts, let them be political, ideological, or categorical. A framework for testing the ideas outlined before is the translation zone. Introduced by Emily Apter in her 2006 book, The Translation Zone, A New Comparative Literature, this concept was foundational to the translational turn. Whereas Apter departs from language and text, she clearly does not limit herself to a purely linguistic analysis, but involves various aspects of social, cultural, economic, and political life. Quoting Apter, the translation zone defines the epistemological interstices of politics, poetics, logic, cybernetics, linguistics, genetics, media, and environment. Its locomotion characterizes both physic transference and the technology of information transfer, end of quote. Apter's translation zone emphasizes the equally important status of elements involved in transmission, even those preventing or disturbing these flows, and challenges how language-bound spatial borders are drawn. Hegemonies and hierarchies can also be detected through applying the translation zone concept to our field of interest. In the Soviet Union and its zone of influence, the dominance of Russian was supposed to lead to, I quote, a harmonious unity in a single word language, end of quote. Instead, the reality was closer to a linguistic multiplicity and phantom internations that had their own cultural dynamics, carriers and actors not detached from mainstream structures. In the translation zones I investigate, I cannot regard their agents entirely non-conformist, this discussion we had previously, since their partly dissenting activities were within / through institutions of the state, and their positions were integrated into socialist infrastructure. The multipolar translation zone that, among others, Helena Kontova, Peter Rezek, Karel Miller, and Peter Stembera founded was physically attached to an office space of the National Gallery in Prague, but was in spirit crossing Czechoslovakia's borders. In this lively translation zone, transmission of ideas happens on a daily basis, as we have already heard from Pavlina. Moment. Historian Catherine Evuthov explains this in The Cultural Gradient, the transmission of ideas in Europe, as follows, I quote, "As they travel across time and space, transmitted by individuals, by texts, by media, ideas become grafted onto, assimilated into the next cultural sphere, in which by virtue of translation, communication, and repetition, they instantaneously and sometimes imperceptibly mutate into something new," end of quote. In the case of the Prague Performance Circle, with the core members mentioned before, transmission and translation resulted in, for instance, artworks, interviews, articles, samizdat publications, and philosophical dialogues I will touch upon in the final section of my method-driven paper. Okay, now to the case studies. It was most probably Clara Kempf-Welch's networking the blog that draw attention to the figure of János Brendel, who became an important personality of promoting Hungarian neo-avant-garde art in Poland. Piotr Piotrowski called him, I quote, an émigré, a sort of ambassador of Hungarian culture, and his longtime colleague in the Department of Art History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan. Brendel compromitted himself in Hungary, and I show this image again, through his involvement in the 1956 revolution, and tried to leave the country a couple of times before he finally found a home in Poland. Here he studied art history, and before his return to the university in 1975, Brendel became an employee of the National Museum in Poznan. It was during this time that the art historian and networker discovered his interest in conceptual art and intended to translate, in quotation marks, its Hungarian variant into his adopted home. The group exhibition of Hungarian artists, Brendel, organized in 1972, toured from the Bureau of Artistic Exhibitions in Poznan to Łódź and then to Szczecin. Among the 26 participating artists were the most important neo-avant-gardists of the time. Politically most provoking was a piece by Gyula Konkoly called Bleeding Memorial. First shown in Budapest 1969, and this is the image actually of the 1969 presentation, the sculpture was basically a human-sized block of ice sprinkled with permanganate crystals and covered in gauze and cotton wool, redefined simple three-dimensional artworks and broke with materiality. While in the process of melting, the ice block, and this was the tricky part, dripped a red fluid onto the floor. Both Kempf-Welch and art historian Géza Boros highlighted that the red color liquid referenced the bloody strike down of the 1956 revolution. Brendel was aware of the Bleeding Memorial commemorating the reform movement. Mentioning 1956, even metaphorically, was a delicate matter for the bilateral cultural relations of Hungary and Poland. This moment of disobedience against Soviet rule was a contact zone for cultures in which Brendel served as a translator. Clara Kemp-Welch wrote that although Brendel, I quote, claimed that the selection of the artworks had been arbitrary, he noted that definite conditions have imposed upon the works their peculiar and various power of expression. Reading between the lines, and this is what we do in the translation zone, contemporary spectators would have understood that Brendel was alluding to the particular cultural politics of the country. End of quotation. Given the transcultural engagement of Brendel, who later founded the book series Bibliotheca Hungarica on Hungarian-Polish relations, he can be described as a cultural broker with an in-between position. Brendel initiated the exhibition that was to bring closer the country's progressive art scenes. Yet the project triggered diverging, perhaps unintended interpretations. In the words of Spivak, in which the text enters its self-staging, what texts can do when they enter the process of circulation is the subject of my second case study. Under the editorial guidance of art critic and art historian Dan Haulika, between 1963 and 1989, the cultural and literary magazine, the 20th century, has grown into an international vessel for artistic journey reports and translations. Haulika itself is an interesting personality since he was a factor in determining Romanian contemporary art and its discourses, while simultaneously stressing an active engagement with histories and actualities of the divided artworks. The editor-in-chief was a talented maneuverer between official party regulations and progress-driven depolitical art. This personality defined the transmission of multilingual content in the journal. Before the background of Nicolae Ceausescu's regime that is usually referenced as extreme hardliner, the establishment of the 20th century was more or less a direct consequence of Moscow's order in the 1960s to create world literature magazines in state socialist countries. Russian authors and artists always had prominent positions in Haulika's journal, but its transmission scope for content spread across globe. The slides I'm showing you right now, or this particular slide, now demonstrate this cross-cultural interest without thorough analysis. The fact that in 1987, the journal received the award for the best literature and art magazine in the world during the UNESCO biennial at Centre Georges Pompidou proves the international recognition of 20th century on the Paris-Bucharest axis. Non-figuratively speaking, translation has been an essential part of the magazine's structure. Expanding the discussion into the field of art politics in Romania, the content allows for cross-cutting binary pairs and breaking open formulaic clusters in a translational manner. Such a multipolarity of analyzed aspects and mutual translations and transformations in exchanging art across East, West, and probably South is maybe an important point of discussion on our transregional agenda. The third and final translation zone I touch upon is the intellectual hub of or around performance art in Prague of the 1970s. This will most probably be a bridge to Hanna Bedius's paper on photography, the lingua franca of performance art, and perhaps a continuation of Pavlina Morganova's presentation. In my research, I originally came from a passage in Clara Kemp-Welch's book on the activities taking place in art historian and artist Karen Miller's office at the National Gallery. She quoted critic and curator Helena Kontova, I quote, Every day, someone would come to our office, an artist or a critic or a theoretician. Peter Rezek was part of the group. They were always bringing translations of new essays from Avalanche and other magazines, end of quote. Taking this location, namely Miller's workroom, as a physical and metaphorical center of intellectual radiation, I became interested in what types of international sources were processed, distributed, and appropriated by the very figures accessing this zone. Kontava was responsible to discuss and promote the work of Czech and Slovak action artists on the pages of the renowned art journal Flesh Art. In 1978, she created an extensive interview with Jan Mulkoch, Peter Stembera, and Karel Miller, and has put together a piece on the role of photography for contemporary arts in Czechoslovakia the same year. Miller and Stembera were both taken by phenomenology and Zen Buddhism that was accompanied by extensive readings, discussions, and artistic experiments. In 1970, the journal Orientace included translated excerpts from Daisetsu Teitaro Suzuki's An Introduction to Zen Buddhism that most likely was an inspiration to Miller to start off his performance meditations and standstills. In terms of meditations, Miller's most private source to balance out rationalism and romanticism in his life and art was Robert M. Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an inquiry into values from 1974. And let me remark that I'm really grateful to Pavlina and Luza for providing me with this information. The philosopher Peter Rezek, and I'm finishing just in a bit, elevated this intellectual engagement and event-based art production to the level of discourse when in 1978, his philosophical sketches on action art and body art appeared in Samizdat. Besides the Samizdat series Pavlina talked about, this particular publication, Stembera, Miller, and Mulkoch, synchronously with similar art practices on the other side of the Iron Curtain. At other times, Rezek interpreted the performances of Czech action artists as dream through applying phenomenological psychology and psychopathology. Translations across disciplines, as well as practice and theory, prove themselves to be rich and fruitful to look beyond art production and context. And this is really the end, entering the translation zone, following the path of languages and the transmission of ideas leads us, for instance, to reconstruct the multiple cultural broker roles Eastern and Central European artists and art theorists played throughout the 1970s. Also, we have recognized how a symbolic event, namely 1956, carried tensions and preconceptions tested through artistic and curatorial strategies. This paper was also an invitation to overcome irritations that a periodical's editorial program can be simultaneously progressive and state-conform, in quotations. May the new cultural geography of East and Central Europe be as revealing as my ambitions for this presentation attempted to be. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I ran out of time.